She was called a traitor. She was called a goddess. She was blamed for bankrupting a nation. She was mourned by a king who wept so hard he could barely stand. And nearly 250 years after her death, people are still arguing about who she really was. This is the story of Marie Antoinette, a girl who became a queen who became a symbol, and a symbol that a revolution needed to destroy. Marie Antoinette was not French, not by birth, not by instinct, and, as her enemies would later scream, not by loyalty either. She was born Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. From her first breath, she was a political instrument. The Habsburg dynasty produced children the way factories produce goods, efficiently, strategically, and with a specific purpose in mind. Maria Antonia's purpose was to seal a fragile alliance between Austria and France, two empires that had spent generations trying to destroy each other. So, at 14 years old, she was dressed, groomed, tutored in French customs, stripped of her Austrian name, and handed across a border to a country she barely understood. She would never see her mother again in person. Only letters. Stern, demanding letters from Maria Theresa would follow her to Versailles for the rest of her life. The girl who crossed that border was charming, beautiful, and almost entirely unprepared for what waited on the other side. The Palace of Versailles was not a home, it was a stage. Every moment, every meal, every morning ritual was a performance witnessed by hundreds of courtiers whose entire existence depended on proximity to the crown. When the young Dauphine woke up in the morning, it was not in private. Dozens of people were present to watch her dress. Dozens more watched her eat. Privacy was a concept that did not exist at Versailles. And at the center of this spectacle sat her future husband, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. He was awkward, quiet, obsessed with hunting and locksmithing, and deeply uncomfortable in social situations. The two were mismatched in almost every way that mattered to a royal court. They married in May of 1770, surrounded by crowds so massive that a stampede killed dozens of people in the streets of Paris. The celebration itself became a disaster. A dark omen, some said later. For years, the marriage was not consummated. The reasons are still debated by historians. Some point to Louis's physical condition, others to simple emotional immaturity. But the result was the same. Marie Antoinette was under enormous pressure to produce an heir, watched constantly by a court that gossiped about her every move, and married to a man who seemed more interested in his workshop than his wife. She responded the way many people do when they feel trapped and misunderstood. She escaped into pleasure, the gambling, the fashion, the parties that ran until sunrise, the secret gambling rooms she funded with royal money, the elaborate hairstyles, some reportedly over a meter tall, that required their own doorways to pass through. The small palace she had built inside Versailles, called the Petit Trianon, where she hosted intimate gatherings and lived on her own terms. Marie Antoinette spent money like someone who had never been told the word enough, because for most of her life, nobody had. The French people had a name for her, l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. But it was also a pun. Autrichienne in French sounds close to a word meaning female ostrich, and it was used to suggest she buried her head in luxury while the country around her starved. France at the time was in serious financial trouble. Decades of war, including French support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. Harvests had failed, bread prices had surged. While the queen spent fortunes on gowns and card games, ordinary people in Paris were calculating whether they could afford to eat. The resentment was real. The gap between the palace and the street was real. What was not always real were the stories told about her. The most damaging scandal of Marie Antoinette's reign had almost nothing to do with her, and everything to do with her reputation. In 1785, a woman named Jeanne de la Motte orchestrated one of the most audacious cons in European history. The target was a diamond necklace, an absurdly expensive piece of jewelry originally commissioned for a previous royal mistress that nobody had been able to sell. The price was so high, it had already been offered to Marie Antoinette herself, and she had turned it down. De la Motte convinced a gullible cardinal that the queen secretly wanted the necklace, but could not buy it publicly. She forged letters. She arranged fake late-night meetings in the gardens of Versailles, using a prostitute who vaguely resembled the queen to play the role. The cardinal handed over a fortune. The necklace disappeared. And when the whole scheme collapsed, Marie Antoinette's name was dragged into every headline. She was acquitted of involvement. The cardinal was acquitted. De la Motte was convicted and imprisoned. But public opinion does not run on court verdicts. To millions of French people who already hated what Marie Antoinette represented, the trial made her the villain of the story, even after the verdict cleared her name. From that point, her reputation never recovered. The revolution came fast when it came. By 1789, France was at a breaking point. The Estates General had been called. The Third Estate, commoners, had declared themselves the National Assembly. The old order was cracking apart, and in July, a Paris mob stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress prison, in an act that would echo through history as the moment everything changed. A few months later, that same revolutionary energy marched directly to Versailles. Thousands of women, furious, hungry, armed, walked through the rain from Paris to the palace gates. They demanded bread. They demanded the royal family return to the capital, and they got both. Louis and Marie Antoinette were escorted to Paris under what was effectively armed guard, to live in the Tuileries Palace under the watching eyes of a city that no longer trusted them. For Marie Antoinette, the transformation was devastating. She had gone from the queen of the grandest palace in Europe to a prisoner in all but name. She wrote letters in secret to foreign courts, to her brother, the Austrian emperor, begging for intervention. Those letters, when discovered, confirmed the worst suspicions. The Queen had been communicating with enemy powers while France was tearing itself apart. The word traitor was no longer a rumor. It was a charge. In June of 1791, Louis and Marie Antoinette attempted to flee. The plan was elaborate. Disguises, a specially built carriage, a route planned to reach the Austrian border. They almost made it. They were recognized by a postmaster in a small town called Varennes, stopped by local guards, and returned to Paris in humiliation. The constitutional monarchists who had tried to work with him now had proof that he never intended to honor his commitments. The radicals who had always wanted a republic now had the momentum. Louis XVI was tried for treason and executed in January of 1793. The crowd at the guillotine reportedly cheered. Marie Antoinette was 37 years old and a widow. She had already watched her children taken from her. She had already endured months in the Temple prison, then the conciergerie, a dark, damp holding cell with no privacy and no dignity. She was put on trial in October of 1793, facing charges that ranged from treason to accusations so obscene that even some of her enemies were uncomfortable repeating them in court. She denied everything. On one particularly grotesque accusation, she turned to the crowd in the courtroom and made a direct appeal to every mother present, asking how anyone could believe she would harm her own child. The gallery went quiet. It did not save her. She was convicted and sentenced to death. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette rode in an open cart through the streets of Paris. Crowds lined the route. She climbed the steps of the scaffold, accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and apologized. "Monsieur," she said, "I beg your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." Her head fell moments later. She was 37 years old. History has never quite decided what to do with Marie Antoinette. Was she a shallow woman who fiddled while France burned? Was she a scapegoat, a foreign-born queen blamed for systemic problems that existed long before she arrived? Was she a victim of a propaganda machine that needed a face to put on everything people hated about the old regime? Was she all of these things at once? What the evidence shows is a woman who was thrust into an impossible position as a child, trained to perform rather than govern, deprived of real power while being blamed for the results of power, and ultimately executed not just for what she did, but for what she symbolized. She was the face of a system, and when that system came down, she came down with it. The rose gardens at Versailles still grow. The Hall of Mirrors still stands. And somewhere in all of it, between the legend, the gossip, the films, and the history books, there is still a 14-year-old girl in a carriage, crossing a border into a country she did not know, carrying the weight of 2 empires on her shoulders. She never stood a chance, and she never stopped trying anyway.